On the last Friday of January 2016, a 20-year-old woman finished her shift at a pub in Northampton, stayed for drinks with friends, and then headed into town for the night. It was the kind of evening thousands of young people have every weekend across England. Nothing about it felt dangerous. Nothing about it seemed like the beginning of the end. By Sunday, India Chipchase had vanished, and what investigators would uncover over the following 48 hours would shake this city to its core and horrify even veteran detectives with decades on the job. This is the story of India Chipchase, and this is the story of the predator who was waiting for her. India Chipchase had just turned 20 years old in January 2016. She came from a close, loving family in Northampton, the kind of family where the siblings actually got along, where everyone looked out for one another. Her mother, Sue Chipchase, and her father, Jeremy Chipchase, raised her alongside her brother and sisters in what everyone who knew them described as a happy, stable home. India had trained as a healthcare assistant and spent time working at St. Andrew's Hospital in Northampton. But her real dream was bigger than that. She wanted to become a paramedic. She wanted to save lives. At 20, she was still figuring things out, as most of us are at that age. She was working part-time as a waitress at the Collingtree Park pub in Northampton while she mapped out her future. She had a boyfriend she'd been seeing for about 3 weeks. She had a wide circle of friends. She had never been in any kind of trouble. Everyone who knew her, family, friends, co-workers, said the same thing. India was sensible. She knew how to take care of herself. That detail, that she was sensible, that she knew how to take care of herself, would later be twisted by some in the media into something ugly. But we'll get to that. Friday, January 29, 2016. India finished her shift at the Collingtree Park pub around 8 p.m. and stayed to have drinks with friends. Later that evening, the group decided to head into Northampton town center, Bridge Street specifically, which is the beating heart of the city's nightlife. On any given Friday or Saturday night, you'll find the street packed with students, young professionals, and locals hopping between pubs, bars, and clubs. India spent the earlier part of the evening with her boyfriend, and later joined up with a separate group of 3 friends. Around 11:30 p.m., the 4 of them grabbed a taxi and headed to NB's, a cocktail bar on Bridge Street that operated more like a nightclub, staying open well into the early morning hours. They arrived in good spirits. It was shaping up to be exactly what it was supposed to be, a normal, fun night out. But sometime before 1 a.m. on Saturday morning, India became separated from her friends. They were at the bar, drinks in hand, and when one of them turned around, India was gone. Her friends weren't alarmed. They assumed she'd either headed home or linked up with other people she knew. There was nothing on that night, nothing at all, that raised a red flag for any of them. Here's what the police were later able to piece together from CCTV footage and witness statements. After getting separated from her friends, India ended up outside NB's, visibly upset. One of the door staff noticed her and asked if she was okay. She told him she just wanted to go home. The doorman did what seemed like the right thing. He flagged down a taxi, confirmed that India had enough money to pay for the ride, and put her in the cab. But the taxi driver refused to take her because, he said, she wouldn't pay up front. So India got out of the taxi and walked back to the front of NB's. She tried to get back into the club, but the door staff wouldn't let her re-enter. Several bouncers later confirmed to police that they remembered seeing her. She sat on the steps outside for a while, alone, clearly trying to figure out what to do next. There's evidence that she attempted to send text messages, trying to reach her friends, trying to reach her boyfriend. A 20-year-old girl, alone outside a nightclub in the middle of the night, unable to get back in, unable to get a cab home, unable to reach anyone she knows. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just stranded, and she was vulnerable, and someone was watching. When police later reviewed the CCTV footage from outside NB's, they saw something deeply troubling. An older man, white, probably around 50, stocky build, not very tall, with a balding head, approached India as she sat alone. He didn't look threatening at first glance, but the way he moved told a different story. Within seconds of spotting her, he was in her face, literally inches away, touching her, speaking to her in what investigators described as a controlling, coercive manner. It looked unnatural. He talked to her intently for about 10 minutes. And then, On the footage, you can see him escort India away from NB's, down Bridge Street by the arm. He's looking around the whole time. Not at her. Around. Scanning for a taxi. Looking for a way to move her out of the town center. To anyone watching casually, it might have looked like a father helping his daughter. Or maybe someone she knew giving her a hand. That was clearly the impression he wanted to give. A couple waiting nearby for their own cab saw them together. The man turned to them and said reassuringly, it's okay, I'll get her home." They believed him. He flagged down a taxi. They got in. India sat in the back seat, on her phone, not speaking. The driver remembered the man asking to be taken to a McDonald's. During that ride, India made 3 consecutive phone calls, each about a minute apart, to her boyfriend. None of them were answered. Those were the last phone calls India Chipchase ever made. Her phone disconnected from the network shortly after 2 a.m. on Saturday morning. Saturday, January 30th. India was scheduled to work a shift at the pub, and she didn't show up. That alone was enough to worry the people who knew her. India was reliable. India was punctual. India didn't just not show up. Her mother Sue and her siblings grew increasingly frantic as the hours passed with no contact. They did everything you'd expect. Calling her phone, messaging friends, posting on Facebook, sending WhatsApp messages to anyone who might know where she was. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. India had occasionally spent a night away from home before, but always with friends, and she always let her family know where she was. This silence was completely out of character. At 4 p.m. on Saturday, roughly 15 hours after India was last seen, her mother reported her missing to Northamptonshire police. India was initially classified as medium risk. She was 20. She had no medical conditions, no known vulnerabilities in the traditional sense. But the fact that her disappearance was so wildly out of character concerned officers, and they began making inquiries immediately, speaking to friends, speaking to family, retracing her movements from the night before. Meanwhile, India's brother and sisters took matters into their own hands. Using Find My iPhone, they managed to track India's phone to the area of Stanley Road in Northampton. Remember that name, Stanley Road. It's about to become very important. By Sunday morning, January 31st, India had been missing for approximately 27 hours. She hadn't come home. She hadn't gone to work. She hadn't contacted a single person. The control room inspector at Northamptonshire Police made the call to escalate the case from medium risk to high risk. When CID detectives came on shift at 8 a.m. Sunday, they took over the investigation. And now the full machinery of a high-risk missing persons inquiry kicked into gear. Detectives began telecommunications work to pinpoint the location of India's phone. Their analysis confirmed what the family had already discovered. India's phone had last been active in the Stanley Road area before it went dark just after 2 a.m. Saturday. House-to-house inquiries were launched in and around Stanley Road. Officers also went back to NB's nightclub to obtain CCTV footage. When detectives reviewed the footage, they saw India, upset, alone, sitting outside the club. And then they saw the man. They watched him approach her. They watched him take her by the arm and walk her away. That was the last confirmed sighting of India Chipchase alive. The investigation transformed instantly. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was a potential abduction, and the clock was ticking. Every hour that passed without finding India made it less likely she'd be found alive. The search radius was expanding. She could be anywhere. To find India, they had to find this man. The lead detective made a critical decision about the grainy CCTV still image of the suspect. Showing it to India's family might cause them unbearable distress. Instead, the image was posted on an internal police network, accessible only to officers and staff. It was a calculated gamble. Could anyone in the force recognize this man from such a poor quality image? The gamble paid off. A police officer came forward and identified the man immediately. He recognized him because he'd had recent dealings with him. Very recent dealings. The man had been arrested just 2 days earlier for drunk and disorderly behavior. And 10 days before that, he'd been arrested for historic sexual offenses dating back about a decade. He would have been in his early 40s at the time. The victims were 14 years old. His name was Edward Tenniswood. He was now 52, and he lived on Stanley Road, the same Stanley Road where India's phone had last pinged. Think about that convergence for a moment. India's family had independently tracked her phone to Stanley Road. The police telecommunications analysis confirmed the same location, and now the man last seen leading India away from the nightclub turned out to live right there. Background checks revealed something strange. Despite those two recent arrests, Edward Tenniswood had no previous convictions whatsoever. Not a single one. He had been arrested, yes, but never charged, never tried, never convicted. The case involving the underage victims from a decade earlier had apparently never made it to court. On paper, he was a ghost. Neighbors described him as a recluse. He'd been a tenant at his Stanley Road address for about 7 years. He rarely went out. He never answered the door. He didn't own a car. But the police couldn't wait for a complete profile. If India was inside that house, she might still be alive. She might need medical attention. Every minute counted. Just before 4 p.m. on Sunday, almost 38 hours after India was last seen, officers forced entry into Tenniswood's home. What the police walked into was deeply unsettling before they even got upstairs. The house was bizarre. There was no carpet. Newspaper covered the floors instead. Thick dust had accumulated in the recesses of each stair step. Items throughout the house, computer keyboards, desks, monitors, were wrapped in cling film. Other objects were covered with white sheets. Bowls of rotting food sat in the kitchen covered with plates. Tenniswood apparently had an aversion to dirt, but rather than clean, he simply covered things up. The whole place felt wrong. It felt like the home of someone profoundly disconnected from normal life. Officers moved through the ground floor and up the stairs. In the front bedroom, on a mattress on the floor, they found India. She was tightly wrapped in a sheet. At the top of the sheet, the officer who discovered her initially thought he saw fur. It was India's hair. Her long, dark hair fanned out around her head like a halo. India Chipchase was dead. There was no need to call paramedics. The only visible injury was a small cut behind her right ear that had bled onto the bedsheet. But later, much later, the full extent of what had been done to her would become horrifyingly clear. The lead detective's first action after discovering India's body was to get officers to her family's home immediately. Within minutes, her parents were told. The devastation was absolute. But there was no time to pause. Tenniswood was not in the house. A manhunt was underway. Police tracked Tenniswood's phone pinging in Northampton town center, but couldn't pinpoint his exact location. It was Sunday. Many businesses were closed. But investigators reasoned that a man recently arrested for drunk and disorderly would likely be somewhere he could drink. Around 30 officers fanned out across the town center, checking pubs, wine bars, and licensed premises. India's body had been found just before 4 p.m. By shortly before 7 p.m. that same evening, less than 3 hours later, Tenniswood was located in the lobby of the Ibis Hotel. He was sober. He was calm. He was sitting at a computer, searching for news coverage about India's disappearance, following along with the story, enjoying it. When officers approached him, he was almost nonchalant. "You've clearly been to the house," he said. "You've found something. I'm surprised you found me so quickly." Upon arrest, police searched his rucksack. Inside, they found a large knife and a pair of plastic latex gloves. So who was Edward Tenniswood? Born in 1963, Tenniswood grew up in Northampton and was educated at a grammar school. By all accounts, he was academically intelligent. He later studied at the University of Warwick and obtained a mathematics degree, subsequently working as an actuary and financial consultant. On the surface, an accomplished man. But beneath that surface, things had been deteriorating for years. By the time of India's murder, Tenniswood was 52, and his life had completely fallen apart. He was unemployed. He was an alcoholic. He lived alone in a house that looked like it belonged in a horror film. He had virtually no social connections. His neighbors barely knew he existed. And he had a disturbing inner world. Police found photographs around his home of women with long, dark hair. Women who bore a resemblance to India. Tenniswood had what investigators described as a fetish, a sexual fixation on women who looked like that. He was deeply, profoundly inadequate as a person, and he compensated for that inadequacy by constructing elaborate fantasies in which he was desirable to women, competent, successful. The reality, of course, was the opposite. He was a reclusive alcoholic who wrapped his keyboard in cling film and covered rotting food with plates. And here's a detail that should chill you. When police reviewed the CCTV from NB's nightclub and spooled back through several weeks of footage, they found Tenniswood. 2 weeks before India's murder, there he was, lurking outside the club in the early morning hours, watching intoxicated women leave. He'd been scouting. He'd been waiting for the right target. This was not a spontaneous act. This was a predator on a mission. Over the following days and weeks, the forensic picture became devastatingly clear. The post-mortem examination revealed that India had sustained more than 30 separate injuries to her body. There were injuries to her neck, her tongue, her cheeks, and her ear. The cause of death was compression to the neck, strangulation. But perhaps the most telling piece of evidence was what was found under India's fingernails. Skin. Edward Tenniswood's skin. India had clawed at him. She had fought. Even intoxicated, even overpowered, she had not submitted. She had fought for her life. Tenniswood himself had defensive injuries, scratches and marks consistent with someone desperately trying to get away from him. Inside the house, police recovered India's mobile phone. They also found a pair of latex gloves with India's blood on the outside and Tenniswood's DNA on the inside. On the Monday morning after Tenniswood's arrest, over 70 detectives were assigned to the case. Forensic analysis of Tenniswood's clothing yielded further evidence, and approximately 3 months into the investigation, when prioritized internal swabs were finally processed, the results confirmed what investigators had suspected from the beginning. India had been raped. During his police interviews, conducted over several days, Edward Tenniswood said 2 words over and over again. No comment. To every question about India, to every question about what happened in that house, to every piece of evidence placed in front of him. No comment. No comment. No comment. For the detectives sitting across from him, it was excruciating. They still had to ask every question, still had to present every piece of evidence, still had to give him the opportunity to respond, because if they failed to put a relevant question to him, and he later claimed in court that he was never asked, it could undermine the entire case. So they sat there, question after question, and listened to nothing. No explanation, no remorse, no acknowledgement that a 20-year-old girl was dead. Tenniswood was charged with murder and rape and remanded into custody. The trial of Edward Tenniswood began on Monday, July 18, 2016, at Birmingham Crown Court. It lasted just under 3 weeks, and from day one, it was a media sensation. Every seat in the press gallery was filled. Reporters filed real-time updates on witness testimony. The nation was watching, and Edward Tenniswood was loving it. He pleaded not guilty to both charges, murder and rape, despite the mountain of physical evidence, despite the CCTV, despite the DNA, despite the skin under India's fingernails, despite the blood on the gloves, despite everything. He pleaded not guilty because in his grandiose narcissistic mind, he genuinely believed he could outsmart the police, outsmart the prosecution, outsmart the jury. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. He wasn't even close. Tenniswood voluntarily took the witness stand, which defendants in England and Wales are not required to do. And what followed was, by all accounts, a performance. He was showboating, treating the courtroom like a stage. He showed absolutely no remorse, no acknowledgement of India's family sitting in that courtroom, no recognition of the grief he had caused. He told the court that India had gone with him voluntarily, that she got into the taxi willingly, that they went back to his home to continue drinking, and because, and I want you to really absorb how absurd this is, because he wanted to give her the grand tour of his home. The home with no carpet, the home with newspapers on the floor, the home with rotting food and cling-filmed keyboards. That home. He claimed they laughed and joked. He claimed they drank red wine together. He portrayed himself as the victim, at one point telling the court how distressing it had been to dress a dead body. During the trial, Tenniswood also made the extraordinary claim that he had once dated the model Heather Stewart White, a claim that was demonstrably false and served only to reinforce the picture of a deeply delusional man who had constructed an entire fantasy life to compensate for the emptiness of his real one. The prosecution dismantled every single one of his claims. The physical evidence told the true story. The more than 30 injuries, the strangulation, the skin under India's fingernails, the blood on the gloves, the staged crime scene, the 2 weeks of surveillance outside the nightclub, and after Tenniswood killed India, he admitted, in his own twisted way, that he had spent time with her body afterward, playing with her hair, cuddling up to her, as he put it, arranging her, wrapping her in that sheet with her hair spread out like a halo. This was not grief, this was possession. This was a man reveling in what he had done. In the aftermath of India's death, some corners of the media did something that needs to be addressed directly. Instead of focusing on the predator, the man who had stalked, targeted, abducted, raped, and murdered a young woman, certain outlets focused on India's drinking. They ran headlines that, intentionally or not, implied that her night out, her intoxication, somehow shared in the responsibility for what happened to her. That framing was irresponsible, and it was wrong. India Chipchase did what millions of young people do every weekend. She went out with friends, she had drinks. She ended up alone outside a club through a series of small, ordinary misfortunes. A lost group, a taxi that wouldn't take her, a club that wouldn't let her back in. None of that is a moral failing. None of that is an invitation. What happened to India was caused by one person, Edward Tenniswood. A predator who deliberately sought out a vulnerable target. A man who had been lurking outside that same nightclub weeks before, watching, waiting. The responsibility lies entirely with him. The investigators on this case said it clearly, and it bears repeating. What happened to India is down to the predator who targeted her because of her vulnerability. It is absolutely not her fault. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. In a trial that lasted nearly 3 weeks, with mountains of evidence and days of testimony, 12 people needed just 2 hours to reach their conclusion. Guilty on both counts, murder and rape. Edward Tenniswood was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years for the murder of India Chipchase, plus 12 years for rape, to run concurrently. India Chipchase was 20 years old. She wanted to be a paramedic. She wanted to save lives. She never got the chance.